How did trying a viral fitness challenge leave half my gym class paralyzed in the hospital? Coach Lansing pulled up the video on the gymnasium projector and told us we'd be trying the vertebral apex challenge as our final fitness test before winter break. My name is Alex Brenner, and I was 17 years old, standing in the gym at Northridge High School, watching Trent Vickers demonstrate a spinal bridge position that made my back hurt just looking at it. The video had 4.8 million views and showed Trent, a fitness influencer with 12 million followers, performing this extreme backbend where his spine curved into an impossible arch with his head nearly touching his heels. He held the position for 60 seconds while balanced on just his hands and feet, his entire body weight compressing through his cervical and lumbar spine. Coach Lansing paused the video and explained we'd be attempting modified versions today, building up to the full bridge over the next 2 weeks. He said Trent Vickers had personally messaged him after seeing our school's fitness program featured in a local news segment, suggesting we incorporate his training methods. Coach Lansing was clearly starstruck, talking about how Trent had transformed modern athletic training and how lucky we were to get his direct attention. Several students were excited, pulling out their phones to look up more of Trent's videos. Others looked nervous, including my friend Kayla Chen, who'd had back problems since middle school. She raised her hand and asked if the challenge was safe for people with existing injuries. Coach Lansing waved off her concern and said Trent's methods were backed by science and that thousands of people had completed the challenge successfully. He showed us 3 more videos of regular people completing the vertebral apex challenge, their spines bent backwards at angles that seemed anatomically wrong. One video showed a woman in her 40s holding the position for 90 seconds. Another showed a teenage boy transitioning from the bridge into a handstand, his vertebrae visible through his shirt as individual bumps along his curved spine. The comments on each video were overwhelmingly positive, people celebrating their completed challenges and tagging friends to try next. Coach Lansing said the challenge improved spinal flexibility, core strength, and mental toughness. He'd been doing it himself for 3 weeks and felt better than ever. He demonstrated a modified version, dropping into a bridge position with his hands and feet planted, his spine arching upward. He held it for 30 seconds before standing back up, smiling triumphantly. He said we'd start with 10-second holds today, building up gradually. Everyone needed to participate because this was worth 20% of our final grade. Kayla raised her hand again and said her doctor had told her to avoid extreme spinal flexion. Coach Lansing's smile tightened, and he said she could get a medical exemption if she brought a note from her doctor, but otherwise, she was expected to participate. The way he said it made it clear he thought she was making excuses. I'd known Coach Lansing for 3 years, and he'd always pushed us hard, but this felt different, more intense, and less willing to accept limitations. We spent the first half of class doing warm-ups and stretching, focusing on spinal mobility. Coach Lansing had us do cat-cow stretches, spinal twists, and cobra poses, preparing our backs for the bridge position. He kept emphasizing that flexibility was the key to athletic performance, and that most injuries came from being too tight rather than too flexible. He showed us another video of Trent Vickers explaining the biomechanics of the vertebral apex challenge, using anatomical terms that sounded scientific but didn't quite make sense. Trent talked about realigning vertebral compression ratios and optimizing spinal load distribution, phrases that sounded impressive but seemed vague under scrutiny. After 30 minutes of warm-up, Coach Lansing demonstrated the entry position, lying on our backs, planting hands beside our heads, pushing up into the bridge. He had us try it one at a time while he spotted us, providing support if anyone started to collapse. I went 5th and managed to push myself up into a shaky bridge, my arms and legs trembling with effort. My spine felt compressed and wrong, like my vertebrae were stacking on top of each other in ways they weren't designed for. Coach Lansing told me to arch higher, to really push my hips up and let my head drop back. I tried and felt something in my lower back pop. Not painfully, but definitely noticeable. I held the position for maybe 8 seconds before my arms gave out and I collapsed. Around me, other students were attempting the bridge with varying success. Most could get into the basic position, but few could hold it for more than a few seconds. Kayla tried despite her concerns and immediately felt sharp pain in her lower back, dropping out of the position. Coach Lansing told her to try again. That initial discomfort was normal when pushing past your limits. She tried a second time and lasted maybe 3 seconds before the pain forced her down. By the end of class, everyone had attempted the bridge at least twice. Coach Lansing seemed satisfied with our progress and said we'd be building up duration over the next 2 weeks. He assigned homework of practicing the bridge position at home for 5 minutes each day, filming ourselves for proof. He said Trent Vickers would be reviewing our progress videos and selecting the top performers for a feature on his social media channels. That incentive changed everything. Students who'd been hesitant suddenly became competitive, talking about practicing at home and perfecting their form. The possibility of being featured on a channel with 12 million followers was too tempting for most people to resist. I went home that afternoon with my lower back aching and pulled up Trent Vickers' profile on my phone. His content was slick and professional, showing him performing various extreme fitness challenges in exotic locations. But when I scrolled through his comment sections, I started noticing warnings mixed in with the praise. Physical therapists and chiropractors were leaving comments saying his techniques were dangerous and could cause serious spinal injuries. They explained that the human spine wasn't designed to support body weight in extreme flexion positions, that the compression on vertebrae and discs could cause herniation or nerve damage. Some comments linked to medical articles about spinal injuries from extreme flexibility training, but these warnings had maybe a few dozen likes compared to thousands on positive comments. Most people were ignoring the experts and focusing on the impressive visuals. Trent's response to criticism was always the same. He'd comment that traditional medical professionals didn't understand modern training techniques, that his methods were revolutionary precisely because they challenged conventional wisdom. He'd point to his millions of followers and thousands of success stories as proof his approach worked. I showed the critical comments to my parents that night, and they immediately said I shouldn't do the challenge. My father was a civil engineer and recognized unsafe structural loading when he saw it. He said putting vertical compression on a spine bent backward created shear forces that could fracture vertebrae or rupture discs. My mother called the school and left a message for Coach Lansing saying I wouldn't be participating in the challenge. The next morning, Coach Lansing pulled me aside before class and asked about my mother's call. I explained my parents' concerns about spinal injury risk. He looked disappointed and said my parents were overreacting based on fear rather than evidence. He showed me a document on his tablet, a study Trent Vickers had published on his website about the safety and effectiveness of his training methods. The study claimed to have followed 200 participants through a 12-week program with 0 serious injuries reported. Coach Lansing said this was peer-reviewed research proving the challenge was safe when done properly. I asked who had peer-reviewed it, and he said it was reviewed by other fitness professionals in Trent's network. That didn't sound like legitimate peer review, but I didn't argue. He asked me to convince my parents to reconsider, saying it would be unfortunate if I missed out on this opportunity and took a grade penalty. That afternoon, my parents met with Coach Lansing and Principal Valerie Stanton. I waited outside the office while they discussed the challenge. When they came out, my mother looked furious and my father looked disgusted. My mother said we were leaving and that I wouldn't be returning to gym class until they changed the curriculum. In the car, my father explained that Principal Stanton had defended the challenge by saying it was part of an innovative fitness program they were implementing across all physical education classes. The school had applied for a state grant to fund cutting-edge fitness initiatives, and featuring Trent Vickers' methods was central to their application. The grant was worth $300,000 and would fund equipment upgrades and additional staffing. My parents had asked to see Trent's published research and were shown the same document I'd seen. My father had pointed out it wasn't peer-reviewed by actual medical professionals or published in any scientific journal, but Principal Stanton had insisted it was sufficient validation. She'd said dozens of schools nationwide were implementing Trent's methods and seeing improved fitness outcomes. My parents had demanded I be exempted from the challenge without grade penalty. Principal Stanton had reluctantly agreed, but made it clear she thought they were being overprotective. For the next week, I sat out during gym class while my classmates practiced the vertebral apex challenge. Coach Lansing had them increasing their hold times each day, pushing from 10 seconds toward the 60-second goal. Most students were progressing, though several complained of back pain and neck soreness. Kayla had gotten a medical note exempting her, but others pushed through discomfort because they didn't want to lose points or miss the chance of being featured by Trent Vickers. I watched from the bleachers as my classmates contorted their spines into increasingly extreme positions. Some were getting good at it, holding bridges for 30 or 40 seconds with seemingly little effort. Others struggled and shook, their faces red with strain. Coach Lansing would circle the gym, offering encouragement and correction, telling students to arch higher and hold longer. On Friday of the first week, Coach Lansing announced that Trent Vickers would be visiting our school the following Monday to film content with our gym class. The announcement created massive excitement. Students started practicing obsessively over the weekend, posting their progress videos on social media and tagging Trent's account. The challenge was spreading through the school beyond just our gym class, with students from other periods trying it during their fitness time. By Monday morning, probably half the school had attempted the vertebral apex challenge at least once. Trent Vickers arrived at Northridge High with a small film crew, expensive camera equipment, and an energy that filled the entire gymnasium. He was 32 years old, muscular and charismatic, exactly like his videos showed. He greeted Coach Lansing warmly and thanked him for being an early adopter of his training philosophy. He talked to our class about pushing past perceived limitations and redefining what the human body could achieve. His speech was motivational and inspiring, filled with stories of people who'd transformed their lives through his programs. Then he demonstrated the full vertebral apex challenge, dropping into a bridge so extreme his head nearly touched his heels. He held it for 90 seconds while his film crew recorded from multiple angles. When he stood back up, everyone applauded. He said today we'd be attempting our longest holds yet, aiming for 60 seconds, and the top 5 performers would be featured in a video on his main channel. The competition was immediate and intense. Students volunteered eagerly, dropping into bridge positions while Trent and his crew filmed. The first student held for 42 seconds before her arms gave out. The second made it to 51 seconds, but started shaking badly and had to stop. The third student, a guy named Marcus Whitley from the football team, held for 58 seconds and nearly made the full minute. Trent was enthusiastic, offering coaching tips and encouragement. He kept saying the key was mental, not physical, that our bodies could handle far more than our minds believed. Around the 20th student, I noticed something wrong. A girl named Olivia Kent was in her bridge position, at about 40 seconds, when her body started trembling differently. Not the normal muscle fatigue shake, but something spasmodic and uncontrolled. Coach Lansing told her to push through it, to make it to 60 seconds. She tried, and suddenly her arms gave out, but instead of collapsing normally, her body jerked and she fell awkwardly on her neck. The sound was subtle but distinct, a muffled crunch that made my stomach drop. Olivia didn't get up. She lay on the mat making a gasping noise, her eyes wide with panic. Coach Lansing rushed over and told her to stand up, that she was fine. But Olivia couldn't move, her legs weren't responding. She started screaming that she couldn't feel anything below her chest. The gymnasium went silent, except for Olivia's screams. Trent's film crew kept recording until he told them to stop. Coach Lansing pulled out his phone and called for the school nurse while students backed away from Olivia, creating a circle of empty space around her paralyzed body. The nurse arrived and immediately called 911, recognizing a potential spinal injury. She told everyone not to move Olivia and to keep her neck stable. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes and carefully stabilized Olivia's spine before lifting her onto a backboard. She was still screaming, crying that she couldn't move her legs and asking what was happening to her. The paramedics loaded her into an ambulance and rushed her to the hospital. Principal Stanton arrived and tried to downplay the situation, saying Olivia had probably just pinched a nerve and would be fine once doctors examined her. She told everyone to continue with class activities, but Coach Lansing had already dismissed us early. Students were crying and hugging each other, traumatized by watching their classmate become paralyzed. Trent Vickers had disappeared without saying anything, his film crew packing equipment quietly. I texted my parents immediately, and they came to pick me up. That evening, news spread that Olivia had suffered a severe spinal cord injury at the C6 vertebra. The compression and awkward landing had caused her cervical spine to fracture, severing her spinal cord. She was paralyzed from the chest down, potentially permanently. Her parents were at the hospital getting news that would destroy their lives. Olivia had been a competitive swimmer with college scholarship offers. Now doctors were telling her family she might never walk again. The school sent an email that night saying gym classes would be suspended temporarily while they reviewed safety protocols. But the damage was already done and getting worse. Over the next 2 days, 4 more students from our gym class started experiencing symptoms. Numbness in extremities, shooting pains down their legs, loss of motor control in fingers. They'd all participated in the vertebral apex challenge and pushed themselves to long holds, compressing their spines repeatedly over 2 weeks. The compression had caused disc herniations and spinal cord compression that were now manifesting as neurological symptoms. By Wednesday, all 4 students were in the hospital undergoing emergency spinal surgeries. 2 had permanent paralysis, 1 partial and 1 complete. The other 2 had severe nerve damage that might improve with surgery and rehabilitation, but outcomes were uncertain. Half of our gym class had suffered serious spinal injuries from the challenge Coach Lansing had made mandatory. Parents were furious and terrified, pulling their kids from school and demanding answers. The media picked up the story and descended on Northridge High with cameras and aggressive questions. Principal Stanton held a press conference claiming the school had followed all proper safety protocols and that the injuries were unfortunate accidents that could have happened with any athletic activity. That lie made my blood boil because my parents had explicitly warned them this was dangerous and they'd dismissed the concerns. Trent Vickers posted a statement on social media saying he was devastated by the injuries and that the challenge was meant for experienced athletes with proper training. He claimed Coach Lansing had implemented it incorrectly and that he'd never endorsed making it mandatory for high school students. That was complete fabrication. My classmates had screenshots of messages where Trent had directly encouraged Coach Lansing to use the challenge and had promised to feature our school. But Trent deleted those messages, and his team scrubbed his social media of any references to Northridge High. The legal response was immediate. Olivia's parents filed a lawsuit against the school district, Coach Lansing, Principal Stanton, and Trent Vickers within a week. The other injured families joined the lawsuit, which grew to include all 5 students and their medical costs. The amounts were staggering because spinal cord injury treatment is incredibly expensive, and long-term care costs for paralyzed teenagers would run into millions of dollars. My parents were contacted by the attorney representing the injured families. Her name was Patricia Wolf, and she specialized in catastrophic injury cases. She wanted to interview anyone who'd witnessed the injuries or had information about how the challenge was implemented. I met with her at her office and described everything from the first class to Olivia's injury. I showed her the screenshots of critical comments on Trent's videos, the warnings from medical professionals that had been ignored. I explained how Coach Lansing had made the challenge mandatory and tied it to our grades, how my parents' concerns had been dismissed. Next, Patricia asked if I had any documentation of the school's grant application, the one that mentioned Trent Vickers' methods. I didn't, but I suggested she could probably get it through Discovery. She smiled and said she would. Over the next month, Discovery and the lawsuit revealed information that made the situation even worse than I'd imagined. Trent Vickers had been warned repeatedly about the dangers of his vertebral apex challenge. Physical therapists and sports medicine doctors had contacted him directly explaining the biomechanical risks and begging him to add safety warnings or remove the challenge entirely. He'd ignored all warnings and continued promoting the challenge because it generated massive engagement. His videos featuring the challenge averaged 3 times more views than his other content, which meant more advertising revenue and sponsorship opportunities. Discovery also revealed that Trent had paid Coach Lansing $5,000 to implement the challenge at Northridge High and film promotional content. The payment had been disguised as a consulting fee for fitness program development. Coach Lansing had never disclosed this financial relationship to Principal Stanton or the school board. But Principal Stanton had her own conflicts. The state grant application that featured Trent's methods included a letter of recommendation from Trent himself, promising his support for schools that implemented his training philosophy. The grant was worth $300,000, and Principal Stanton's job performance review was tied to securing funding for innovative programs. She'd pushed Coach Lansing to implement the challenge, knowing it was central to their grant application, even after my parents had raised safety concerns. Discovery revealed emails between Principal Stanton and Coach Lansing discussing how to minimize parental objections and maintain participation rates. In one email, Principal Stanton had written that they needed at least 80% student participation for the grant application to be competitive. She'd suggested that students seeking exemptions should face grade penalties to discourage opt-outs. These emails destroyed any claim that the school had prioritized student safety. The most damning discovery came from Trent Vickers' business records. His fitness empire was sponsored by a medical equipment company called Novaspine that manufactured spinal surgery devices. Novaspine had paid Trent over $2 million in sponsorship fees over the previous year. The company specialized in devices used to treat spinal cord injuries and disc herniations. Industry analysts suggested Novaspine had financial incentive to see increased spinal injury rates because it expanded their customer base. While there was no evidence they'd explicitly encouraged Trent to promote dangerous activities, the financial relationship created obvious conflicts of interest. Trent's challenge was generating injuries that required exactly the type of surgical hardware Novaspine produced. Patricia Wolf added Novaspine as a defendant in the lawsuit, arguing they'd enabled dangerous promotion of activities likely to cause injuries requiring their products. The media coverage exploded when these connections were revealed. Stories ran nationally about the fitness influencer whose dangerous challenges were funded by companies that profited from the resulting injuries. Trent Vickers lost millions of followers and dozens of sponsorships as companies scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. His social media accounts, which had featured hundreds of extreme challenges, were suddenly full of comments from people saying they'd been injured trying his techniques. Physical therapists and doctors who'd been warning about his methods for years were finally being heard. YouTube removed hundreds of Trent's videos for violating community guidelines about dangerous content. Other social media platforms followed, effectively ending his career as a fitness influencer. Coach Lansing was immediately fired by the school district and had his teaching license suspended pending investigation. Principal Stanton was placed on administrative leave and eventually forced to resign. The school board issued a formal apology to the injured students and their families, acknowledging catastrophic failures in safety protocols and oversight. The state denied their grant application and launched an investigation into how the dangerous challenge had been implemented district-wide. Olivia Kent's condition became the focus of media coverage because her injury was the most severe. She was paralyzed from the chest down with no hope of recovery. Her swimming career was over, her scholarship offers withdrawn. She spent months in rehabilitation, learning to use a wheelchair and adapt to life as a quadriplegic. Her parents had to modify their entire house for wheelchair accessibility, install lifts and ramps, and hire full-time care assistants. The family's life savings were depleted within months, which was why the lawsuit's success was critical for their future. The other injured students faced different challenges. Marcus Whitley had partial paralysis in his legs and underwent multiple surgeries to decompress his spinal cord. He regained some function, but would never walk normally again. His football career ended, along with his dreams of playing college sports. Sophia Nguyen had nerve damage in her hands that required surgery and extensive physical therapy. She was a pianist who'd been planning to audition for conservatory programs. The nerve damage meant she couldn't play at her previous level, likely never would again. Her future in music was destroyed. The other 2 students had varying degrees of recovery, but all faced permanent limitations and chronic pain. The civil trial began 18 months after the injuries occurred. I attended several days of testimony and watched as the full scope of negligence and greed was laid out in court. Trent Vickers' attorneys tried to argue he was just a content creator sharing fitness ideas, and that he couldn't be held responsible for how others implemented his challenges. But Patricia Wolf presented evidence showing Trent had actively encouraged Coach Lansing to make the challenge mandatory, had paid him to implement it, and had ignored medical warnings about its dangers. She showed the jury videos of Trent demonstrating the challenge with no safety warnings or disclaimers about the extreme spinal compression involved. She presented testimony from physical therapists, explaining how the forces generated during the challenge exceeded safe limits for vertebral and disc structures. Expert witnesses described the catastrophic injuries in clinical detail, helping jurors understand the permanent damage these teenagers had suffered. Coach Lansing testified that he'd trusted Trent Vickers' expertise and genuinely believed the challenge was safe. He claimed the payment from Trent was for general consulting and hadn't influenced his decision to implement the challenge. The emails revealed during discovery made this defense implausible. He'd written to Trent after receiving payment, saying he'd make sure the challenge was prominently featured in his classes. Principal Stanton testified that she'd believed the challenge was properly vetted and that Coach Lansing had assured her it was safe. But her own emails showed she'd prioritized grant funding over safety concerns. She'd dismissed my parents' warnings without proper investigation and had pressured Coach Lansing to maintain high participation rates. The jury heard testimony from my parents about their meeting where they'd raised safety concerns and been dismissed. My father explained the structural engineering principles that made the challenge dangerous, comparing spinal compression to loading a column beyond its critical buckling point. My mother testified about requesting to see proper medical research and being shown a non-peer-reviewed document from Trent's website. Their testimony established that school officials had been explicitly warned and had chosen to proceed anyway. Nova Spine's attorneys tried to distance the company from Trent's activities, claiming their sponsorship was for general fitness content and they had no knowledge of specific challenges. But Patricia Wolf presented internal emails showing Nova Spine executives discussing the marketing value of Trent's extreme content and the potential for increased device sales as awareness of spinal injuries grew. While the emails didn't explicitly encourage dangerous challenges, they showed company leadership understood the connection between Trent's content and their product demand. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning verdicts. They found Trent Vickers liable for gross negligence and awarded $28 million in compensatory damages to the 5 injured students. They added $12 million in punitive damages, sending a message about the dangers of promoting extreme challenges without proper safety warnings. They found Coach Lansing liable for negligence and breach of duty, awarding $8 million in damages. Principal Stanton and the school district were found liable for negligence and failure to protect students, with $15 million awarded against them. Nova Spine was found liable for negligent sponsorship and awarded $10 million in damages. The total judgment exceeded $70 million. Trent Vickers filed for bankruptcy within weeks of the verdict, claiming the judgment would destroy him financially. The bankruptcy court allowed the injured students to pursue his assets, but much of his wealth had been transferred to offshore accounts or hidden in complex business structures. The families eventually recovered about $8 million from Trent, far less than awarded, but still substantial. Coach Lansing lost everything. His house, savings, and pension were seized to satisfy the judgment. He ended up working manual labor jobs, his teaching career permanently ended, and his reputation destroyed. He gave one interview saying he genuinely believed he was helping students and that he'd never intended to hurt anyone. But intention didn't matter when 5 teenagers were paralyzed because of his choices. Principal Stanton faced similar financial ruin and professional disgrace. She'd lost her career in education and would never work in school administration again. The school district's insurance covered most of their portion of the judgment, but the district faced severe budget cuts and administrative turnover. Nova Spine settled separately with the families, paying $30 million and agreeing to implement strict guidelines for influencer sponsorships. They created a medical advisory board to review all sponsored content and added mandatory safety disclosures to any fitness-related promotions. The settlement included no admission of wrongdoing, but the company's stock price dropped 20% as investors worried about liability exposure. The broader impact of the case extended far beyond our school. YouTube and other social media platforms implemented new policies requiring safety warnings on extreme fitness content. Influencers promoting physical challenges had to include disclaimers about injury risks and recommendations to consult medical professionals. Several states passed laws requiring schools to have medical professionals review any fitness programs before implementation. Insurance companies started requiring additional safety protocols for school athletic programs. Fitness industry organizations created certification programs emphasizing injury prevention and medical oversight. Trent Vickers' downfall became a case study in influencer liability and the responsibility of content creators. His entire fitness empire collapsed within 2 years of the Northridge High incident. Other people who'd been injured attempting his challenges came forward with their own stories, filing additional lawsuits and revealing a pattern of dangerous promotion. By the time all legal actions settled, Trent had been connected to over 40 serious injuries. His net worth, which had peaked at $15 million, was completely depleted. He attempted to rebuild his career under different names, but was recognized and exposed each time. His last known activity was working at a gym in a small town under his real name, teaching basic fitness classes. The fame he'd cultivated so carefully was gone, replaced by infamy and financial ruin. Olivia Kent's life took a different trajectory than anyone expected. She became a passionate advocate for spinal cord injury research and disability rights. Using her settlement money, she funded a scholarship program for students with physical disabilities pursuing higher education. She spoke at schools about the dangers of social media challenges and the importance of questioning authority when something feels unsafe. Her story was featured in a documentary about influencer culture and social media responsibility that won awards and generated important conversations about online content regulation. She eventually enrolled in law school specializing in disability rights law, wanting to advocate for others facing similar challenges. Her transformation from competitive swimmer to disability rights advocate was inspiring, though she'd never chosen this path and would have given anything to have her athletic career back. Marcus Whitley went through years of rehabilitation and regained enough function to walk with assistance devices. He couldn't play football anymore, but became a coach for adaptive sports programs, helping other young people with physical disabilities stay active. His settlement money funded his education and medical care, allowing him to build a life different from what he'd planned, but still meaningful. Sophia Nguyen's hand function improved enough that she could play piano again, though not at her previous elite level. She shifted her focus from performance to composition and music therapy. She worked with rehabilitation programs using music to help spinal injury patients maintain cognitive function and emotional well-being during recovery. The other 2 injured students recovered better physically, but struggled with chronic pain and psychological trauma. Both required ongoing medical care and therapy. Their settlements provided financial security but couldn't restore what they'd lost in terms of normal teenage development and futures without medical complications. I graduated from Northridge High 6 months after the trial concluded. My relationship with the school was permanently damaged by watching administrators prioritize funding over safety and then try to cover up their negligence. I'd learned that institutions often protected themselves rather than the people they claimed to serve. I'd learned that popularity and charisma could mask dangerous incompetence. Most importantly, I'd learned that speaking up about safety concerns mattered even when authority figures dismissed them. My parents' willingness to challenge the school had probably saved me from becoming another paralyzed teenager. I went to college studying biomedical engineering, focusing on spinal injury treatment and prevention. The experience at Northridge shaped my career choice completely. I wanted to understand spinal biomechanics well enough to prevent injuries like those that had destroyed my classmates' lives. I wanted to create safety protocols that couldn't be ignored by administrators chasing grant money or teachers chasing fame. During college, I stayed in contact with several of the injured students, watching their journeys through rehabilitation and adaptation. Their resilience was remarkable, but I never forgot that their injuries were completely preventable. 5 years after the incident, I was completing my master's degree in biomedical engineering when I received an unexpected message. Trent Vickers wanted to talk to me. He'd found my contact information through mutual connections and said he wanted to apologize for what happened at Northridge High. Part of me wanted to ignore him, but curiosity won. We met at a coffee shop near my university. Trent looked different from his influencer days. Older, smaller somehow, without the polish and confidence that had made him famous. He started by saying he thought about Northridge every day, about the students whose lives he'd helped destroy. He said he'd convinced himself that pushing boundaries was inspirational, that extreme challenges motivated people to exceed their limitations. He'd ignored medical warnings because they conflicted with his brand identity as someone who rejected conventional thinking. He'd accepted Novaspine's sponsorship money without considering the ethical implications, because it validated his influence and funded his lifestyle. He said watching his empire collapse had forced him to confront how much damage he'd caused, chasing views and engagement. I asked him what he expected from this conversation. An absolution I couldn't give him? He said no, that he knew there was no forgiveness for what happened. He wanted to warn me about something that was starting to worry him. New fitness influencers were emerging using the same tactics he'd pioneered, promoting extreme challenges without proper safety warnings, ignoring medical advice, prioritizing viral content over participant well-being. The platforms had implemented new policies, but creators were finding workarounds: private groups, subscription services, international platforms with fewer regulations. The cycle was repeating because the financial incentives remained powerful. He said someone needed to work on this problem from the inside, creating safety standards that actually protected people rather than just limiting platform liability. He thought my background in biomedical engineering and my personal experience with the consequences made me uniquely qualified. I told him I'd consider it, but that I needed him to understand something. His apology meant nothing to Olivia, who would spend her entire life in a wheelchair. It meant nothing to Marcus, who still needed surgery every few years to address complications from his spinal injury. It meant nothing to Sophia, whose concert pianist dreams died because he wanted engagement metrics. He'd destroyed 5 lives because he prioritized fame over safety, and no amount of reflection or warning about future problems changed that. He nodded and said he understood, that he deserved my anger and the anger of everyone he'd hurt. Then he left, and I never heard from him again. But his warning stayed with me. I finished my master's degree and accepted a position with a nonprofit organization developing safety standards for fitness and athletic activities. We worked with social media platforms, insurance companies, medical associations, and educational institutions to create comprehensive safety protocols. The work was tedious and bureaucratic, nothing like the exciting career in medical device development I'd once imagined. But every time I reviewed a proposed fitness challenge or evaluated a training protocol, I thought about my classmates at Northridge High. I thought about Olivia's screams when she realized she couldn't move her legs. I thought about my parents challenging Coach Lansing and Principal Stanton when they knew something was dangerous. I thought about how many injuries could be prevented if safety concerns were taken seriously before disasters happened, rather than after. 10 years after the vertebral apex challenge destroyed half my gym class, I attended a conference on sports medicine and injury prevention. One of the keynote speakers was Olivia Kent, now a disability rights attorney and activist. She spoke about her journey from competitive swimmer to wheelchair user to advocate, about how the worst moment of her life had revealed her life's purpose. After her speech, we talked for the first time since high school. She asked what I was doing now, and I explained my work on fitness safety standards. She smiled and said that was perfect, that we needed people who understood both the technical aspects and the human cost. She said the lawsuit and settlement had given her financial security and a platform to create change, but the best outcome would have been never getting injured at all. That prevention was always better than compensation. We talked about organizing a symposium, bringing together injury survivors, medical professionals, policymakers, and platform representatives. The goal would be creating enforceable standards that actually protected people, rather than just limiting corporate liability. Olivia said survivors needed to be centered in these conversations because they understood the stakes in ways others couldn't. The symposium happened 8 months later and brought together over 200 participants. Survivors of fitness challenge injuries shared their stories. Medical experts presented research on common injury mechanisms. Platform representatives explained their current policies and limitations. Policymakers discussed regulatory frameworks. Insurance companies talked about risk assessment and liability. The conversations were difficult and sometimes contentious, but productive. We developed a framework for evaluating fitness content that balanced creative freedom with safety requirements. Challenges that involved spinal loading, joint hyperextension, breath restriction, or other high-risk activities needed to include medical disclaimers and supervision requirements. Platforms needed to proactively identify dangerous content rather than waiting for injuries to trigger removals. Creators needed liability insurance and safety training before promoting physical challenges. Schools needed independent medical review of any fitness programs before implementation. The framework was adopted voluntarily by several major platforms and became the basis for legislation in multiple states. It wasn't perfect, and enforcement remained challenging, but it represented significant progress. Coach Lansing died 7 years after the incident. A heart attack at age 53, probably accelerated by the stress of financial ruin and public disgrace. I felt nothing when I heard the news. He'd made choices that destroyed multiple lives and had paid the price, but his death didn't undo the damage or provide any satisfaction. Principal Stanton disappeared from public life entirely. Last I heard, she was working administrative jobs outside education, living quietly under the weight of her failures. Trent Vickers resurfaced briefly when a journalist writing a retrospective on influencer culture tracked him down for an interview. He was 42 years old, working 2 jobs to pay ongoing court judgments, living in a small apartment. He told the journalist he'd destroyed his own life, along with the lives of the people he'd injured. That the fame and money had been intoxicating but ultimately meaningless. The article positioned him as a cautionary tale about social media excess and the dangers of prioritizing engagement over ethics. I read it and felt the same emptiness I'd felt about Coach Lansing's death. These people's suffering didn't balance the scales or restore what had been taken. 15 years after half my gym class was paralyzed attempting the vertebral apex challenge, I stood in a gymnasium at my old high school. Northridge had invited me to speak at an assembly about social media safety and critical thinking about online challenges. The school looked the same physically, but everything else had changed. New administration, strict safety protocols, comprehensive medical oversight for all athletic activities. Current students knew about what happened in 2024. It was part of the school's history now, a reminder of what could go wrong when adults failed to protect the children in their care. I told them about Coach Lansing's projector showing Trent Vickers' video, about how 4.8 million views had seemed like validation that the challenge was safe, about Olivia Kent collapsing on the gym mat and screaming that she couldn't feel her legs, about the 5 students whose lives were permanently altered because popularity was mistaken for safety and authority figures ignored warnings. I told them that views and followers didn't make something legitimate, that expert warnings mattered even when they were less popular than enthusiastic endorsements. I told them to trust their instincts when something felt dangerous, to speak up even when authority figures dismissed concerns, to understand that some mistakes couldn't be fixed no matter how much money changed hands afterward. After my speech, students asked questions about social media, about how to evaluate online content, about what had happened to Olivia and the others. I answered honestly, not softening the reality of permanent paralysis or the limitations of legal justice. One student asked if I blamed myself for not doing more to stop the challenge. I said yes, that I'd known it was dangerous, but had stayed quiet too long, that watching my classmates get injured while I sat safely on the bleachers created guilt I still carried. But I'd learned that guilt without action was worthless, that the only meaningful response to preventable tragedy was working to prevent future tragedies. The gymnasium where Olivia Kent had lost her mobility was now used differently. Before any athletic activity, students had medical screenings. Equipment was carefully maintained and inspected. Supervision protocols were rigorous. Safety warnings were prominent. The changes came too late for 5 teenagers, but they protected hundreds of students who came after, students who would never know how close their school had come to destroying their futures, because administrators wanted grant money and coaches wanted fame. Justice came slowly and incompletely, but it came. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.